Ian and I, Haggerty, and we're just on the veranda of the homestead up at the Mollerin farm, and beautiful morning to boot. But it's been one heck of a dry start to the season.
No stored moisture down deep, there'd been no significant rain, so it's been an extremely dry start, and dry seeding. Yeah, now we've had the rain in the last couple of weeks, and 90 mil for the growing season, and just the turnaround has been remarkable. It's really been a game changer.
It's a fairly substantial program for the crop this year. I think it was about 10,500 hectares.
About 14,000 hectares all up. That was including cover crops. So so we put in about 2,500 to 3,000 hectares of cover crops, and the rest were cash crops. And we took on a lot of new country this year. So being such a dry start on that country, it was a challenge in itself. But it all went in, and it went in really well. And it just goes to show the resilience of the program, to be a total natural program going in the way it has. So it's got no artificial stimulants on it, for it just to sit so long, and then just it's bounced away. And we'd had plants germinate on just low rainfall events, 2 and 3 and 5 mil events. Yeah, they've come away really well. It's been impressive.
And what was really interesting too, because we had all the a lot of mated ewes. The season was presenting itself. So, we were almost getting to the point we're thinking, right, we're going to have to reduce numbers, and the ewes had started lambing, so we're committed to carrying them through. But fortunately, then some of the crops were at a stage where we could actually graze a lot of the crops, so we're actually putting the sheep through the crops, and they've done absolutely no damage at all. They've actually enhanced the crops' growth, and that sort of got us through. And now we've got really quite a lot of feed on hand, which is fantastic. So we've been able to get away from having to reduce stock numbers by using that cropping country, which has been a real benefit. But also what did show its hand early on in the season was those native summer active plants that we had a look at previously with the mulla and some of the paspaldium and those summer grasses. Even though there hadn't been much rain, because it's been so warm, they were still carrying through, and they're still out there active now because it still hasn't really got that terribly cold. And that's what carried a lot of the mobs of sheep through. The ones that actually had that in their paddocks, just fantastic, weren't they? It's like they were on really abundant winter feed, because those summer plants kept growing even though there wasn't much rain. And the mulla was this tall and thick, and lots of protection for the land, but also great feed for the sheep, wasn't it?
The thing that's been remarkable this year, we've left the stock in a lot longer on those cash crops, and we'd go back and on a standard learning and think, it'd be time to shift them out of there now, and you look at the paddock and they're just not touching the crop at all. They're going through eating those native grasses and the mulla and around the edges, and any ryegrass or radish that might be in the crop, and you go back again and they're still happy there. So it really saved the program. We just kept the livestock on the cash crops for just so long, right up to crop that was actually is running up, it's got the head in the boot starting to come out, and we've only just been pulling them out now, and there's been really no impact on the crop at all.
We took on a fair substantial bit of land, new country this year, but was it about 20,000 acres or something?
Yeah, 23,000 acres here.
And so the property we're on yesterday, those young sheep have been grazing through the crops there, and we put them there in April when we took the farm on, just to start inoculating that property with the microbes in their gut. Put them over as much of the cropping country as we could. So basically the sheep were just in front of the tractors the whole time, so that was my job. All the seeding was keeping the sheep just in front of the tractors, so that we could have the maximum impact of that soil inoculation going on through their gut microbiome. Yesterday we popped them onto a paddock that has been left out in a pasture phase, but hasn't got very good pasture density, as you saw. So what we're going to do is, while the soil's a bit soft with the moisture, is actually get the animals to work a little bit with their hooves and start to stimulate that paddock so that it can go into crop next year. You watch them walk around the paddock, so they've always got their nose just off the ground, and they're basically smelling what's going on underneath that soil surface. And I've spoken to a few scientists about this, and just their ability to respond to an area that's really lacking good microbial activity. So it might be a really compacted soil or a really badly affected saline soil, and the animals will sniff those parts out, and then that's where they'll go and do all their toileting, because they know that those areas need, one, the nutrients, but also the microbial populations. So they don't actually need to be put there physically. They sort that out themselves if they've got those opportunities. This property here we've been very fortunate, got quite a bit of native bush remnants on it, but there's still a lot of land here that needs to be revegetated with biodiverse vegetation and indigenous plants and the grasses and the forbs that were naturally here. And they're the ones that can tolerate those climatic variabilities because they're accustomed to these areas, and they're just so prolific and so nutritious. And I was speaking to a scientist from Murdoch University, and she was telling me that the mulla, which is a native plant out here, is better than chicory, which is often included in lots of cover crop plantings. And if you've got it naturally out there, why on earth would you need to go and plant an expensive seed when it's so prolific in its own right? So yeah, we've just got to recognise a lot of these indigenous plants are just marvellous in their nutritional capacities, so that then that can translate to the animal health and then ultimately human health, whether that's through the grains or whatever food product that you've got coming off the land.
The performance in the livestock has just been a really quite incredible turnaround. Once you give them access to that true diversity, just how they perform, even through, like I said, this was a very dry start to the year, and it's a lot of pressure on the animals, especially ewes. Having lambs, because none of them, all they really receive from us is a bit of hay. Occasionally get a bit of hay, and there's no grain feeding or anything like that, so we're just actually grass fed on what's out there, and the performance of the animals has just been superb. The wool clip that came off was incredible, and it was clean. It was the yields were good, and the lambing percentage was excellent as well. But it's just how you note how those animals graze, the selectiveness and how they perform on the landscape, and it just seems to take the pressure off the landscape and make it just a lot easier to manage.
Well, it's interesting, that mob of young ewes that we moved yesterday, they were just coming up 13 months old, never been drenched in their lives, never been fed grain, but you can see they're all really well grown. They've already been shorn twice.
And in the past, in these operations, they look at cash cropping as the holy grail, and that grain yield as the thing that drives a lot of income around the place. Well, that's not the top one on our list. It's the environment, the natural capital of what we do, and everything works in harmony to everything. So I think once you take your focus off that, and the grain yields are good, there's no doubt about it, but it's the whole operation working as one, and I think it works in sync. And so you look at a cash crop grain paddock a lot different, and we're looking across at these days, and there's wildflowers coming up in amongst them, and it's in amongst your cash crops, and we're finding more animal life in amongst them, from echidnas actually out in amongst the wheat paddocks, and everything's there, the mulla native grasses in them, bush turkeys, and it's and the whole thing just seems to work. And then by actually putting the livestock through it, it's not like they're just forced onto a monoculture crop. They've got all this other diversity, even though we'll harvest that as a cash crop over the top.
And ultimately the grain quality as well, because in the grains actually got access to a lot of extra nutrients that a lot of these other plants bringing to the surface all the time as well. So not to mention what the sheep have done in transferring that throughout the landscape, but it's all going on within that ecosystem.
A real easy indicator to look at is actually your wool clip, and when you shear after hard seasons, start to seasons like this, and the ewes have raised, some of them have raised twins, there's a lot of twins out there, you'd expect that to suffer, but it's as even as can be. The strength on the wool is really good.
59 newtons per kilotex, which is pretty phenomenal strength. So the sheep aren't suffering at all in that regard, so they're able to consistently put it into their wool quality, even if they're under tough environmental conditions.
It's still bright, lustrous, we're pushing 100% comfort factors on that, and so to be still achieving that in the harsh conditions that have been, it just goes to show the evenness of nutrition. We've had that explained to us. By scientists, why those processes are working and these outcomes are coming. So it's been great. And then you look at your meat quality, everything like that as well, just how those animals are doing and the animal welfare.
Something that's been interesting along the wool lines is the interest from some of the fashion houses in Europe and some of the European wool processors to look at that whole story of how the wool's grown, so the animal welfare outcomes and the environmental outcomes, the biodiversity outcomes and all that kind of thing, and they're starting to understand, because the wool processors themselves are seeing how this wool performs under the processing side of things, and then how that can be an outcome into the actual garment at the end of the day for the fashion houses. And really focusing now on how the proteins in the wool fibre are formed and how important that is on that wool quality. And as Em was saying, it's around about that 100% comfort factor, and its strength means it does handle the processing well, but it's just got a beautiful elasticity to it as well. So it's been really interesting getting the feedback from them, and they're really keen to expand these kind of lines. So
it's good to see the big end of town really starting to be very conscious about what's going on and getting behind and supporting these things.
Well, you look at wool as a fibre, it's carbon-based fibre as well, so it's an obvious carbon sequestration tool.
Everything these days seems to get lost in the middle, and that's where that disconnect from customer to where their food or their fibre actually comes from. And I think we've got to open these chains up and actually deal direct right away from the top, have the drawdown right away through to the farmer.
Ian often talks about replanting or having about 30% of the landscape at least back to these biodiverse revegetation areas or native bushlands enhancement, I guess, but that's the real critical part. We're wanting to get big areas of land restored with biodiverse revegetation. What we've been doing at the moment is working on that soil function, because it's really important to get the soil function happening first before you start to plant the trees, because otherwise you don't get any understory. So once we start cropping or cover cropping or whatever we do to start with, and using the biostimulants and the animals to restore that microbial function within that soil, then all the native plants can come as an understory, and then when you plant the trees in amongst that, you've got a real true ecosystem instead of trees planted on bare ground, which if you go through that big tree plantings down there, lots of trees, and the trees aren't doing that terribly well anyway, but there's just nothing underneath them, and yes.
So you don't just end up with a planting with bare ground underneath and then be really diverse in your planting and what you're doing, from salt bushes through to everything, through to all the natural bush tuckers. And so that's our aim on our arable land. We've got a lot of native bushland throughout this property, but on our arable land to take about 30% of it back to all those plantings. And then we can cycle the livestock through them and into the cover crops and the cash crops, and just have that total natural flow of what's happening.
Yeah, so really wanting to look at doing that fairly rapidly. So looking for support in achieving that, because there's big swaths of land out here that needs this happening. So it's a fairly significant enterprise to be getting out there planting millions and millions of trees. It's going to end up being. It's going to take a few years to achieve that, but we really need to get that off the ground as soon as possible, I guess.
Rather than just being isolated farmers doing their own thing, it's actually about bringing more people in, opening the opportunity for the consumer or the big end of town investment to actually come in and actually get involved in what's going on this landscape regeneration and food and fibre production. It's so unless they can have opportunities to get involved, it doesn't seem to happen, and they seem to trying to get into systems that mightn't work, but to get into well-balanced systems that mightn't just be a tree crop, but this is a combination of everything. It's a combination of bush tucker, it's a combination of fodder shrubs, it's a combination of wool production, grain production, whole habitat to whole food production, to actually open our minds and your paradigm to think, well, it's just not about us doing it, it's actually involving more, because that gets the whole planet involved in.
We're all very aware of climate change, and you see a lot of lack of resilience in the landscape when there's these extreme weather events like there was with the big wind event, which has been quite common through the southwest corner of WA in the autumn time, and the big dust storms that happened at the beginning of this year. And then you have farmers that want to get livestock out of their system because, you know, they're considered to be the cause of this, but it's not really. It's basically a landscape that's not functioning appropriately. The animal's not being managed appropriately, and so that's why we've really got to urgently address these things so that we can prevent those, you know, further damage occurring, so that everything can function better with and safety against climatic extremes, which, as we're aware, are going to be knocking on our door, or are knocking on our door now in Australia, and we've got to do whatever we can as fast as we can to alleviate that.
Rather than it just being big operations with big machinery and not many people per square acre of country, it's on average where we can actually bring and start the different enterprises and bring that the whole diverse thing, because it's about community, it's about cultural, it's about landscape, and it's about food production, the whole lot. We've got a population to feed and clothe and look after, and we can do both. We can look after the environment plus produce as well. So the answer's not going into monoculture trees, you know, just wholesale planting. It's about doing this diverse relationship, and if you've got more animals you can get through those plantings and have that whole harmony, you know, the better it'll go. So this is why we say we opened it up to bring people in.